States opening statement, they talked about how Janssen has two drugs, Duragesic and Lucenta. Duragesic introduced in...
Mr. Rodway,
Yes.
if you don't mind just turning this way so Tanya can hear you better.
I'm sorry. Neurobiology, which was introduced in 1991, over here on the chart. We heard some talk about 1997. And Lucenta, ER, which was introduced in May 2012. It doesn't take much to see that this chart doesn't discuss either. It purports to show opioid deaths in the red line, but it doesn't tell you much about it. So, the top line on opioid sales, as far as Lucenta, those are not ours. We have 5 years of Duragesic sales when the chart even starts. As far as these opioid deaths, the chart doesn't tell you whether those opioids were taken as prescribed. And I apologize, my handwriting started off bad and it got worse the older I got. And if they were properly, or if they were prescribed, whether they were misused. Or illegal.
Could you repeat that?
Or illegal. You have to examine the details because facts are stubborn facts. Now, I got to look at this, and I saw that it's marked as CDC MMWR 2011. This is States Exhibit 1221. I suspect we'll see it again. So I went to the report on which this was based to look and see what was in it. That 2011 CDC report has a conclusion in it. The conclusion, in part, states as regulators of healthcare practice have the responsibility and authority to monitor and correct inappropriate and illegal prescribing. The report, at least as far as I could see in my review of it, did not mention Janssen or any manufacturer. The actual chart is behind it there. That is not the actual chart from the CDC report, and we will discuss why that's important a little later. But those conclusions made in the 2011 report include others. Public health interventions to reduce prescription drug overdose must strike a balance between reducing misuse and abuse and safeguarding legitimate access to treatment. That is still the position of the federal government. Here is the FDA's statement from just a few months ago, talking about enabling treatment for patients living with serious pain. Striking the right balance between legitimate access to treatment and appropriate treatment for pain. So what kind of pain are they talking about? I don't demean or question the pain of families facing the horror of addiction. No family member wants to have that happen to a loved one. No father wants to bury a son. That will not be questioned in this courtroom by us. In fact, it's why we go to so much trouble to see that everyone understands the risks of these drugs. But I want to fall back just a minute and talk about why these drugs exist. We have all suffered pain. Some of us, fortunately, less than others. We have all hit our finger with a hammer. We have all suffered the pain of a toothache. We have all broken bones, been burned, and we hate it. It is the memory of what it was like to be pain-free that gets us through those times. I want everyone to think of what it would be like if instead of going away, that pain stayed with a person every day, every hour, every week, every year, and never went away. Serious chronic pain is a soul-stealing, life-robbing thief. It leads to depression. It leads to suicide. People can't take care of their own basic functions. You will hear from doctors who practice right here in Oklahoma some of those stories. But when we talk about the balance between the risk of addiction and the reality of unrelenting chronic pain, that is the balance that the government is speaking about. To try to put it in perspective, this is from the CDC. 1 in 5 adults in the United States suffers from chronic pain. Not my words, words of the Center for Disease. There are 50 million people with chronic pain, adults that suffer chronic pain. And high-impact chronic pain, almost 20 million. Many of those people right here in our state. This has tremendous consequences for our country as a whole. It is estimated by the CDC that $560 billion is lost to pain each year. And as I said, it increases the risk of depression, the risk of suicide. I cannot tell you that Janssen did not invent this disease. It is trying to assist with the treatment of this disease. No matter what causes the pain, cancer, burns, sickle cell anemia, or any other chronic pain situation. This has been recognized for a long time. It was written about in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 1973. The Federal Interagency Committee on New Therapies for Pain, which was issued a report to the White House in 1979. The Federal Interagency Committee on New Therapies for Pain, which concluded new medications and delivery systems are needed to address untreated pain. So let's just stop at Diversion. As I indicated, Diversion was approved in 1991 for the treatment of chronic pain. What it had was a unique delivery system. That was a timed release patch. It took, as you'll see, Janssen a decade to develop that delivery system. Go ahead. In 2008, Nucynta was released in its instant formulation. That is immediate release. In 2011, as I indicated, Nucynta extended release was released. Now, what Nucynta, it's important to understand, we talk about opioids as if they're all the same. And I assure you they are not. Diversion is a timed release fentanyl product released via a patch. Nucynta is a pill, but by the time Nucynta IR was released, the plaintiff has already conceded the opioid crisis was in full view. So Nucynta sought to take care of that with a new molecule, which I'm going to go into a little later, called tapentadol.
Called what?
Tapentadol. Please don't ask me to spell it. It gets worse, as Brandon said. Go ahead. In 2013, the FDA rejected PROP, which has been mentioned already, a petition signed by Dr. Kolodny to limit the use of opioids. They sent him a letter which said, in part, "Dear Dr. Kolodny, when prescribed and used properly, opioids can effectively manage and alleviate suffering. Clearly a public health priority." And in 2019, literally just a month ago, the FDA reaffirmed in this report that striking the right balance to appropriate access to treatment and the risk of opioids was the correct thing to do. The FDA remains focused on striking the right balance between reducing the rate of new addiction by decreasing excessive exposure to opioids through rational prescribing while still enabling appropriate access to treatment for patients living with serious pain. So, what does Janssen do with that history? Janssen is not just in pain, it is in a variety of healthcare areas. These up here are the ones that this nice lady has been involved in. Women's health care, anti-infectives, Alzheimer's, infectious diseases, antipsychotics, pain, neurology, and others. Go ahead, Jack. As I said, the Duragesic patch was introduced in 1991 as Schedule II opioid, just like Nucynta is. Now, this is important. A Schedule II opioid. What does that mean exactly? Schedule II. The drug or other substance has a high potential for abuse. The drug or other substance has a currently accepted medical use in treatment in the United States or a currently accepted medical use with severe restrictions. Abuse of the drug or other substance may lead to severe psychological or physical dependence. That's what a Schedule II opioid is. The people prescribing Schedule II opioids know this. They have to know it to get a DEA licensed to prescribe it. When we seek approval of a medication, the FDA determines that the benefits outweigh the risks. But we don't just come up with this stuff easily. There is a need, as we already saw, a need for the treatment of chronic, unrelenting, soul-stealing pain. We develop a drug to meet that need, but we don't just release it on the market. It must go through clinical testing in 3 phases. Then the manufacturer submits a new drug application to the FDA. In this case, the application to the FDA was over 60 volumes of material. The FDA reviews that application, approves the drug and its labeling, and then it can be released to market. After that, there is post-market surveillance to determine whether there are any unknown risks to the drug that need to be revealed. All of this occurred with Duragesic. It took a decade to get that through so it could be released to market. At every step, the government was involved with oversight and endorsement. Now, you've heard a little bit in this case about Tasmanian alkaloids and Noramco. That first highlighted area shows the various organizations that regulate and govern the production of poppy, or the raw ingredient for an opiate. Opiates being naturally derived from opium, opioids being synthetically manufactured. You heard a very clever catchphrase. oversupply, and people will die. You may not be old enough, but I am, to remember if the glove fits, you must acquit. Same pentameter, same kind of catchphrase. The trouble with it is, the government controls the amount of active pharmaceutical ingredient that can come into the country. The DEA sets the import limits. So, you go to an API or active pharma ingredient supplier, which are also governed by these organizations, to a manufacturer, which is now also governed by these organizations, to a distributor, which is also governed by these organizations, to a healthcare provider who adds some more, because when you get to the healthcare provider stage, you run into a physician who is licensed by the state of Oklahoma, who prescribes a drug through a pharmacy licensed by the state of Oklahoma, who turns it into the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, a program with constant monitoring by the state of Oklahoma. So when you hear, oh, they called on high decile prescribers, the state of Oklahoma had better information about that than any drug manufacturer, because while ours is voluntary, theirs is mandatory. And what they do with that information is most important. It then gets to a patient, in the case of a Medicaid patient, through the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority, which you've heard a little bit about, and then is paid for by payers who have formularies who make judgments about it as well. In this case, you'll hear about Sooner Care and Health Choice, Sooner Care being the Oklahoma Medicaid division, and Health Choice being the state insurance program. API suppliers are not limited to Neurobiology. Neurobiology is one of many. But regardless of who they are and where they are, the supply is fixed by the government. It limits the amount available for opioid production. From registered farming, we can't plant any more than we're permitted to plant. You heard something about the high thebaine poppy. Doesn't have a thing to do with the strength of an opioid or the amount that can be imported. We have to apply for manufacturing quotas, same form. We have to apply for procurement quotas, and we have to sell under the auspices of the FDA. After it leaves the manufacturer, it falls under the purview of state and federal regulators, governed distributors, laws relating to pharmacies and physicians and patients. Both pharmacists and physicians have an independent responsibility to prescribe and monitor these drugs. You'll hear no dispute about that. None. They must be licensed by the state of Oklahoma, registered with the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. You'll hear that referred to as OBN and OBNDD, depending on the time frame. They must be registered and get a special license from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. They must record and report to the state every prescription written. And they must reapply periodically. and be tested again periodically. You heard something about warning labels. Class 2 drugs come with warning labels. Duragesic and Nucynta ER are no exception. The very first thing those warning labels say, warning, addiction, abuse, misuse, life-threatening. Duragesic exposes users to risks of addiction, abuse, and misuse, which can lead to overdose and death. Nucynta ER exposes users to risks of addiction, abuse, and misuse, which can lead to overdose and death. Any claim that we attempted to hide the risks falls under the strength of these labels, which clearly tell you the risk of using the drug. If you go on through the label, the proper patient for whom it should be prescribed, the proper dosage, how to counsel the patient, how to monitor the patient for safe use. I briefly referenced the history of Duragesic. We began to develop Duragesic in 1980. It was approved by the FDA in 1990. It was the first ever transdermal patch delivery system. We launched the product in 1991, and contrary to what you heard before, we never relaunched it. It was approved for the treatment of chronic pain from the day the FDA approved it to this day. It was approved for use by the Oklahoma Drug Utilization Review Board. You'll hear that referred to as DERB. You probably have in several of our hearings already. DERB is a statutorily mandated committee under the Healthcare Authority that decides what drugs should be allowed and how they should be used and on what tier they go, which we'll get to in a minute. And since 1991, Duragesic has been covered by the state insurance programs. As I said, indicated for the management of chronic pain, has always been. Now, what do we know about Duragesic as it relates to reports of addiction? As I told you before, we have post-production monitoring. Here's one from 2006, after the drug had been out 15 years. Worldwide, 600 million patches, 1.6 billion patient days, and 103 reports of addiction. Also has low rates of diversion. We're going to talk about diversion here in a minute. This is just one quarterly report totaling 675 diversion cases. Only 16, or less than 1%, involved Duragesic. Diversion being basically the theft of legal medications to place on the illegal market. So it has low rates of addiction and low rates of diversion, and that is why when you hear pill mill and you think of pill mill, you don't hear about patch mills, because it has low rates of abuse and low rates of diversion. So how about Nucynta? Nucynta wasn't just any opioid. It had a new dual-acting molecule, tapentadol. There's how to spell it. We got it. It's up there. T-A-P-E-N-T-A-D-O-L. Again, it took a long time to develop it. 9 years in this case between the start of development and product launch. Even longer for the extended release for chronic pain. And it was the first opioid product launched with a REMS, or Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy program, to go with it. Now, what do I mean by dual acting? It is a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor as well as a mu agonism, MU agonism. That means that while it has an opioid part, it also has another action which treats pain without having to have the entire pain treated by an opioid. As someone explained it to me, it both goes to the site of the pain and that part of your brain which receives pain signals. Nucynta came out with a protective coating designed to discourage misuse. And there were tests done on it showing that it was actually so hard that if you put it in a coffee blender to try to crush it, to misuse it, it actually broke the blades on the coffee blender. That's how hard the coating was. This is Bruce Moskowitz. You'll hear from him in this case, describing the molecule better than I can.
The molecule itself, Pentanol, has more than one mechanism of action. So one mechanism of action, which is mu opioid agonism, similar to other opioids, and a second mechanism of action called norepinephrine reuptake inhibition. In animal models, we had data that suggested it was not as euphoric, it was not as attractive. And therefore, because we were getting similar analgesia, but without gaining that analgesia solely through the mu opioid agonism, that there would be a lower propensity for euphoria and associated issues, abuse, misuse, diversion.
Is that what you saw in the monitoring data? Is that what the company saw, what you saw in the monitoring data?
Yes, it was.
So Janssen marketed 2 drugs, unique in low diversion and abuse rates. Are they completely safe from abuse? No, that's why their labels clearly tell you they are subject to the risk of addiction. But that's why we went to all the trouble to design it in the way we did. Go ahead. As I told you, there is a surveillance system. You'll hear about that now.
Did the company continue to track this data from the radar system and the other active surveillance resources that are described here going forward from the time of this presentation in 2007?
Yes, we did.
And can you say in general terms what the company saw as a result of that surveillance?
I was involved with contacting with radars and reviewing the reports. We reviewed the reports and we consistently saw that the abuse, misuse, diversion of Duragesic was at a very low level, certainly at a low level relative to other opioid compounds, and remained so throughout that period of time. Later on, we used similar systems. We started with tapentadol and learned the same low rates of abuse, misuse, and diversion for tapentadol.
I'm going to take a stab at radars. I think it means research on abuse, diversion, and addiction reporting surveillance, or something very close to that. But that's the system that's being discussed there. And you'll hear more about it as the trial goes on and how that data is collected. So, what are the abuse rates for fentanyl and tapentadol as compared to other drugs you've heard about today? Oxycodone, sold as OxyContin, or hydrocodone, sold as Lortab. I want to get the scale on this chart here. It looks like the diversion rates are at the top, but that's a function of the graph. You'll see 3.5 per 100,000. If we had 100,000 of those lines, that's how tall that chart would be. I didn't think you would want us to cut through your roof and have the chart shooting up stories high, so we cut it off at 3.5, but just to give you scale on the chart. You can see the rates of abuse as reported for oxycodone and hydrocodone, OxyContin and Lortab by trade name, compared to Duragesic and tapentadol. Actually compared to fentanyl and tapentadol, which is important because fentanyl is all fentanyl, not just Duragesic, but all fentanyl. Low abuse rates. How about diversion? If we charted the same thing on the same kind of chart, oxycodone and hydrocodone and fentanyl and tapentadol. Low rates of diversion. We only have certain data from the state. One of the things we have, though, is the Oklahoma Medicaid opioid prescriptions. And Janssen's Duragesic and Nucynta prescriptions make up less than 1% of those prescriptions approved for and paid for by the state. If you look at Health Choice, or the state employee insurance system, the rate is even less. You saw some worldwide information. We would like for Duragesic and tapentadol to be the opioids of choice here and worldwide because we believe they offer benefits in diversion, abuse, and misuse. This is what we have in Oklahoma. Now the FDA drives and approves every word on the Duragesic and Nucynta label. It also approves wording on instructions given to patients for safe use. If the label is changed, Janssen notifies doctors with Dear Doctor letters about those changes in the label so that they will be fully informed on any change in the risk or use profile. You heard a little bit about marketing, and I want to touch on that if I can. Generally, you'll hear about 3 types of communication that Janssen has with the medical community. One is clearly branded marketing. That's labeled approved marketing. It's reviewed and approved by the PRC, which is our review committee in-house. Doesn't involve any marketing people. It's all science people, compliance people, those types of folks. And it's focused on the branded medication being discussed. You heard a little bit about unbranded marketing. It also is approved by the same committee, but it's focused more on therapeutic disease areas as opposed to any specific product, and doesn't contain a mention of brand name. And then, of course, Janssen contributes to scientific trials, but there are also independent studies that go on that are reported to physicians through medical schools and meetings and that kind of thing. Now, this is Dr. Lynn Webster, who practices in Salt Lake City, Utah, deposed in this case. He's a founding member of the Utah Academy of Pain Medicine. He sits on the boards of the American Academy of Pain Medicine. We asked Dr. Webster what he thought about the allegations in this case, since he is one of the people Janssen looks to as what you have heard referred to as a key opinion leader. And by the way, these people are key opinion leaders because they're giants in their own area. This doesn't matter whether it's heart disease or liver disease or diabetes. These people are accomplished experts in the area before Janssen ever takes up the area. And we work with them to make sure that these drugs do the right thing.
Now, Plaintiffs' Counsel did not share this with you earlier, but I'm going to read a quote from the state of Oklahoma's complaint in this case. It's called a petition. And I'll read from paragraph 62 of the state's petition. It reads in part, like Dr. Portnoy, multiple defendants utilized Dr. Webster as a KOL, providing him with funding and consultant fees in exchange for spreading their misrepresentations regarding opioids and opioid use in general through CMEs and speeches. Were you aware that the state had made that allegation against you? No. Do you believe that in exchange for consulting fees, you have spread the misrepresentations of any defendants in this case?
Right.
Dr. Scott Fishman is the medical director at UC Davis Medical Center. He is set on the board of the American Pain Society. He's a committee member of the National Pain Strategy of the National Institutes of Health, chair of the advisory board for California Cure's prescription drug monitoring program. And let's see what Dr. Fishman says about the allegation he was used to misrepresent things.
In your mind, the importance of a key opinion leader was to educate other physicians on pain management or the use of opioids in the treatment of pain or other mechanisms for treating pain, correct?
Correct, independent of any of the wishes or needs of a pharmaceutical company.
When you were speaking at medical education activities, symposia, lectures, and presenting education on pain treatment and pain management, was it your intention to influence the prescribing habits of the audience, particularly the healthcare providers that were able to prescribe controlled to new products?
It was my intention to help these providers, these clinicians, think through the prescribing decisions they needed to make, and on both the side of not being afraid to use them like benefits outweigh the risks, but also to be cautious about the risks and not use them when the treatment's worse than the disease. So it was really both sides, but at some point it was education around how to responsibly use these medications.
Is it your understanding though that pharmaceutical companies paying, whether directly or indirectly, key opinion leaders to provide medical education, that they were intending that the lectures and speeches would increase the prescribing habits of physicians that were in the audience listening to those programs?
Again, I don't know that they did or not. What I can tell you is that my belief was that pharmaceutical companies should, and I think do, recognize that it's in their interest that these drugs are used safely and effectively.
And then we have Dr. Portnoy, whose name was mentioned earlier and whose deposition will be played in this case. Dr. Portnoy is the chair of the Department of Pain Medicine and Palliative Care at Beth Israel Medical Center in New York, member of the American Pain Society, Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicines. Dr. Portnoy was sued, and you'll hear this. He was sued in not this particular case, but this litigation. Facing bankruptcy, he reached an agreement, which you will have in evidence, which basically made him a...
Excuse me, Mr. Otway, I just object, that's a patent misrepresentation. Dr. Portnoy was never sued in this litigation, which is what you just said.
I said he was not sued, Brad.
You said he's not in this case, you said he was sued in this litigation. That is not true. It's correct. He's never been sued in this litigation. Ever.
That is correct. He's never been sued in the state of Oklahoma, and in the settlement agreement I was just describing, out of the case in which he was sued, it said those people would make their best efforts to keep him from being sued in this case if he agreed to act as a consultant in these cases. But he's not off the hook. If they believe he's not being truthful, they may sue him again. So based on that understanding, he was not sued in this case. You're going to hear from him. I want you to hear his whole deposition. But I just want to play.
I must also object. This is patently misrepresenting any interaction that we've had with Dr. Portnoy. We haven't entered into any settlement agreements with him, nor have we sued him.
Objection is noted. You may proceed, Mr.
Yes.
Otway.
And as I said, you will have the settlement agreement I referred to in evidence, so there's no misrepresentation about it. Even Dr. Portnoy testified this.
So I'm trying to break that down and ask it simply. You never sat in any CME course in which the presenter presented materials that were unbalanced or inappropriate in light of the science on use of opioids for chronic non-cancer pain, correct?
Yeah, not that I recall.
Likewise, you never gave a CME in which you presented information that was unbalanced or in any way inappropriate reflection of the scientific literature as it relates to opioid use for chronic non-cancer pain, correct?
Correct.
But in the category of actions speak louder than words, Dr. Portnoy will tell you in his deposition that he treats his mother for chronic pain with long-acting opioids. So you've heard now a little bit about the key opinion leaders. Let's talk about the various groups that you've heard referenced. Can you put those up for me, James? These fall into 4 basic but not perfect categories. And let me just say this. These exist not just in the area of pain, but in the area of any health concern. So if you have heart problems, you've heard of the Heart Association, these same kind of groups exist there. You've heard of diabetes, same kind of groups. Neurological problems, same kind of groups. These just happen to be the ones for pain. If I were to put up a chart for the American Heart Association, you would find groups such as Women Heart Health, Heart Failure Society of America, American Cardiology, College of Cardiology, the Heart Foundation. And you would find that those groups were funded in part by companies such as Janssen. The same is true of professional groups here. I put the dates on them though, so you could see the ones that have existed for a long time. The American Geriatric Society did not start with the release of OxyContin or Duragesic or Nucynta. It was founded in 1942. The American Pain Society in 1977, Academy of Pain Medicine in '83. Well, you can read for yourself, but I'll just point out one other one that was mentioned in Mr. Beckworth's opening. The Federation of State Medical Boards, founded in 1912. 1912. That's even before I was born. These are the groups you'll hear about in this case. And let's hear from Dr. Webster again, the nice fellow from Utah, about the independence of these third-party groups. You're not aware of any instance where a pharmaceutical company influenced any publication or opinion put forth by the American Pain Society, are you? Flatly, the answer is no. Well, let's look at the state's theory. Remember the chart I told you out of that CDC report? The one that turned into this? If you put the unbranded marketing for Nucynta, because there's no complaints about Duragesic that I'm on this chart, you can plainly see that none of the marketing had anything to do with the upward ticks in those movements. None whatsoever. On there, the first one is Let's Talk Pain, and then in 2009, Finding Relief. And if you remember, Finding Relief was, I think, one that we talked about before. This was put up in the state's case to show that there was a misrepresentation about the term rarely addictive, but I simply set the FDA statement from the same year beside it. And I'll read the first. Many studies show that opioids are rarely addictive when used properly for the management of chronic pain. And the statement of the Federal Food and Drug Administration of the same time. Studies have shown that properly managed medical use of opioid analgesic compounds taken exactly as prescribed is safe, can manage pain effectively, and rarely causes addiction. No misrepresentation there. So not only does the release of the material not fit the state's theory, the actual material doesn't fit the state's theory. All of this, of course, is designed to get information to an individual doctor. They use the term target as something negative. We'll need to see if that word appears somewhere in the abatement plan. But regardless, patient comes to a doctor with concerns, symptoms, and a medical history, all of which is unique to that patient. A doctor licensed by the state of Oklahoma, the DEA, to prescribe these class 2 highly addictive substances. He has in his arsenal of tools the FDA labels I referred to, his treatment in medical, or his education in medical school, medical textbooks, clinical literature, continuing medical education programs, other physicians he talks with, clinical experience, and the state would have you believe that all of that is impacted by a dinner with a sales representative. Over 100,000 call notes, and you may see how many. The sales reps, you heard, well, we're going to bring them into the state, give all this false information, and they're going to escape. No. The sales representatives live right here in Oklahoma. Mr. Hunter said he represents the people of the state of Oklahoma. These are the people of the state of Oklahoma. They live right here. They send their kids to school right here. They go to doctors right here. They take medication prescribed by those doctors right here in Oklahoma. Do you really think? They raise their children here and send their children to doctors here. That doctor has an independent obligation, as confirmed by Mr. Webster. It's not a sales rep's decision. It's his decision. And even more disturbing, the state says, well, your sales representatives called on high-prescribing physicians. High-prescribing physicians, the identity of which were fully known to the state through that monitoring program I mentioned. High-prescribing physicians who are most in need of that education. And when they say yes, and even to some physicians who ran pill mills, I say this. Do you really believe those physicians ran pill mills because they were unaware of the addictive nature of opioids? They ran pill mills because they were fully aware of the addictive nature of opioids. So what does the state of Oklahoma have to do with any of this? This is just a chart of the organizations you'll hear about. You'll hear more about this as the case goes on. But as we're concerned, we're here with the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority and the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority's Drug Utilization Review Board. 10 members representing the Oklahoma State Medical Association, Oklahoma Osteopathic Association, Oklahoma Pharmacists Association, the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers, Pharma, all required by statute. So what did the people on the Drug Utilization Review Board know? What did the state know, and when did it know it? Well, they certainly know that opioids are vital for the treatment of chronic pain. Pain control is an important part of treatment for numerous chronic conditions, and restricting access to these drugs significantly decreases quality of life for individuals with these conditions. Here's an Oklahoma doctor, Dr. Jeff Halford, who has testified in this case that, yes, from the very first day he was an intern, he used opioids and opiate pain medications for patients were appropriate. Here is the chairman of the board of the Drug Utilization Review Board for the state of Oklahoma, Dr. John Muchmore. Being asked, did the College of Pharmacy ever present information summarizing the medical literature on the benefits or convenience of long-acting opioids for the treatment of chronic pain? John Muchmore. We already knew that. be like giving us a treatise on why we need to breathe oxygen in our air. Okay, the benefits. How about the risks? How about the risks of opioids? Dr. Muchmore again. Are you aware, doctor, that the opioid medications have a risk of addiction and abuse associated with them? Of course. When did you first learn that? 1967. You believe it's common knowledge among medically trained individuals that opioids carry the risk of abuse and addiction? Yes. So we've talked about different types of opioids. I've explained what ours were, Duragesic and Nucynta, and why they were unique in the marketplace. What about other ones you hear about? Hydrocodone, OxyContin, Lortab, Percocet, Vicodin. What did the Drug Utilization Review Board have to say about them? I've put up some of the minutes. You're going to hear a lot more. All of the minutes are listed as exhibits. They knew they were easier to divert, easier to obtain, cheaper. Hydrocodone, the most abused drug. That was in 2001. One of the biggest problems I have, the Lortab problem, 2006. I can't imagine this is responsible prescribing, 2004. And they knew it encouraged diversion. How do you know? They talked about it. So what did they do with all this knowledge? They put hydrocodone and oxycodone, and this is a 2013 tier system. The tier 1 is the drug that you can get with no prior authorization. We'll talk about it a little later on. But they are available for use without prior medication. Look where Janssen's products are. They're in tier 2 and tier 3. Requiring either failure of one of these opioids or some reason that you need to go right to tier 2, such as you're allergic to OxyContin. And even after the filing of this, go ahead, I'm sorry, and this is just a graphic showing you the amount of prescriptions written in that year, 2013, of the drugs that the DIRB had said were easier to divert and easier to abuse and cheaper. Hydrocodone, 338,798. OxyContin, oxycodone, 78,462. And there's Nucynta, Duragesic, and Nucynta in ER placed on that chart. That's a summary of the 2013 state paid prescriptions as to those drugs. So what do we have today? This case was filed in 2017. I mentioned before, even before the first meeting of the Attorney General's task force. Wonder why we didn't attend. So what do we have now, today, in the state's tiers? Oxycodone, OxyContin, and where are Duragesic patches and Tapendadol, those drugs which we make? Tier 2. Can't get them without prior authorization. So, again, what did the state know and when did it know it? As it comes into court to seek the recovery, seek your judgment. Purdue Pharma told the Drug Utilization Review Board in 2001 that there were reports of illegal misuse, abuse, and diversion of OxyContin. In 2002, the threat assessment noted that diverted opioids were readily available in most parts of Oklahoma. In 2003, there were multiple reviews of OxyContin over prescription, but look what happened with Duragesic. The DERB reviewed Duragesic and decided no action need be taken. In 2004, the abuse of opioid pain relievers, serious and growing public health problem. Oxycodone and hydrocodone most frequently named. In 2006, the DERB was warned of diversion of illegal drug imports into the state. This is a recording. There's a transcript at the bottom of a 2007 Drug Utilization Review Board meeting.
Things are all through one product. One thing I sometimes seems to happen, it's a hospital patients where suddenly somebody has to go in and 300 doses of something. I mean, if they have to, okay, write a prescription, I got that, and write a prescription. It concerns me where all this stuff goes.
Nephews and nieces, cousins. Not to mention the streets.
I mean, if we're having to go through 3 prescriptions to get to your 2.
There is underground pharmaceutical sales that is very rampant, especially in transplant medications, where people may die and leave quite a store of medication behind, long-acting narcotics. They get around. They get sold underground.
So, oversupply and people die. Diversion and people die. Illegal sales and people die. Duragesic, no action needed. Dependidol, not even on the market yet. In 2007, the Drug Utilization Review Board discussed the fact that Purdue had pled guilty. You've heard about that. I won't go into it anymore. But did they delist OxyContin? No. And in fact, in 2015, there is an email of the Healthcare Authority congratulating Purdue on partnering with the state of Oklahoma to make OxyContin cheaper. The Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics said that the problem of hydrocodone, several hundred Oklahomans were seeing more than 10 doctors. More than 10 doctors. So what did the state do with all this knowledge? It continued by its tier system to encourage hydrocodone prescriptions, despite those statistics. It discouraged the prescribing of the abuse deterrent formulations I've just discussed. The PDMP, the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, was not made mandatory until 2015. It still has not passed a law restricting the ownership of pain clinics to physicians. It has been presented with pleas for more diversion agents, and yet there's been testimony in this case that the number of diversion agents has not changed since 1980. You saw the earlier opening reports I showed you about the 2-year delay after receiving notice of neonatal issues, and it did not start its quantity limit 4 and no more until 2014, which they now say has reduced prescription drugs in Oklahoma by hundreds of thousands of pills. Diversion is rampant in Oklahoma. This is Cindy Hamilton Fain. You'll hear from her later in the case. 500,000 pills diverted in Oklahoma once or twice a year. Not patches, pills. 1,000 taken once or twice weekly. What is a cause of the opioid crisis? We also have illegal drugs that unfortunately come into our country. You'll hear testimony about charts like this, about China and fentanyl, but the DEA also has mapping about this, and Oklahoma is unfortunately situated right in the middle of Tornado Alley, as we know from last week, but also at the crossroads of drug transportation. So, where do the drugs come from? This is from a couple of months ago. I can't remember. I can't read it very well. February 27, 2019. Oklahoma City report large fentanyl bust. 19 pounds. How much is 19 pounds of fentanyl? It's enough to kill every person in the state of Oklahoma with 400,000 people left over. One bust alone. And is that the only one? No. In 2016, Oklahoma seized 7 pounds of heroin-laced illegal fentanyl. In 2017, 8.8 pounds of illegal fentanyl with a dismantled Cleveland County fentanyl lab. You saw this chart? As one that is supposed to show you that deaths track fentanyl sales or deaths track opioid sales. All I've done with this chart is put Tapentadol or Nucenta and Duragesic on it to show you that if you're trying to use that line, it doesn't work. Our sales actually going down while deaths from other opioids go up. Here's the health choice data for that same period. Total reimbursed opioid prescriptions versus Janssen's products. Just in another graphic. And what does the CDC say about even using that argument? In 2016, changes in fentanyl submissions and synthetic opioid deaths were not correlated with changes to fentanyl prescribing rates. Those charts are not the answer. So, what does the state need to prove? What can it prove? What should it? The state would have you believe that Janssen makes opioid problem, and that's all it's needed. But it's not. The state has said it needs to prove marketing statements made by Janssen were misleading under Oklahoma law, that a doctor read that misleading statement, that he acted on that misleading statement and prescribed a drug, that the patient took the drug as prescribed and became addicted or died. How much proof of that will you hear in this case? None. How many patients, how many evidence, how many How much evidence is there going to be to prove this theory that the state has brought, this nuisance theory? We have 100 years of precedent in Oklahoma. It's all right, Janice, go ahead. On this statute, unreasonable and warranted or unlawful use by a person or entity of property. I'm not going to argue the law now. We'll have plenty of time to do that, Mr. Burridge and I, as the case progresses. But you've already seen the 100 years of precedent. And whether it's this kind of case to say gun manufacturers are liable for gun violence, or energy manufacturers, energy producers are liable for climate change, or soft drink manufacturers are liable for diabetes, nuisance just doesn't apply here. Jansen's conduct was not a nuisance. They provided medically necessary medications for the treatment of terrible, terrible problems. Those medications were approved and regulated by the FDA, lawfully marketed and licensed to Oklahoma doctors, licensed by the state of Oklahoma, lawfully prescribed by doctors licensed by the state of Oklahoma, dispensed by pharmacists here who have an independent obligation to make sure they're being dispensed properly, licensed by the state of Oklahoma, and in the case of Medicaid patients, reimbursed by the Oklahoma Health Care Authority. Total documented number of addictions or death due to an Oklahoma doctor acting on an alleged Jansen misrepresentation and prescribing a Jansen medication that we have been presented with in this case? 0. And how many would it take for us to be responsible for a nuisance, a public nuisance, even if the theory could be stretched that far? The state is seeking damages, not abatement. You've heard of the, well, everybody knows that Teva was in this case, reached a settlement. Purdue was in this case, reached a settlement. And if they stood up and took responsibility, I'd like to see that in the release. But here's the state's damage demand is to us. What does that demand encompass? Many things. You're going to hear more about it. One of the things is universal screenings for all Medicaid patients 4 times a year, for all substance abuse except tobacco, including alcohol, for a 30-year period. 4 times a year, universal screening. And there, next to it, is Jansen's percentage of reimbursed prescriptions from the state of Oklahoma, its Medicare system. There's also some other stuff. This isn't mocking anyone, it's just stuff included in the abatement plan. Mr. Whitten pointed out the syringe exchange program for a company which never made an opioid you needed a syringe for. Yoga, meditation, things now not paid for by the state of Oklahoma, but they would like us to pay for. So, here we are in Cleveland County. I have practiced my whole life in court wells like this. I looked at the wall the other day, and I go all the way back to Alvin Brown, my first experience in this courtroom. All those judgments, right up to here. And now you. I know this is the place to decide disputes. I look forward to trying this case before Your Honor, because I believe this is a place with a level playing field. Why would a company like the people I represent come to a state being sued by the state's attorney general, asking for the state to give itself money? Why would they do that? You say you can't fight City Hall? Multiply that times 10,000 for what we're fighting now. It's more than simple slogans. But if we're talking about lessons, we're a state that is not poor. We are rich in resources and people. We can solve this problem, but we don't need to do this to do it. Why are we here? Because when you're right, you fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rodway. We'll take a break before we invite the state to call its first witness. Let's begin at 3:10.
All rise.
Your Honor, before we call our first witness, Mr. Ottaway and I have conferred. In the pretrial order, it says that the rule of sequestration was invoked. Both sides have decided that we are not invoking the rule of sequestration. We just want to put that on the record.
Okay, the record will so reflect.
Thank you, Your Honor. May we call our first witness?
Yes, you may.
We call Dr. Julio Rojas.
Raise your right hand. Just solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Whitten.
Would you tell the court your full name, please, sir?
Julio Isidoro Rojas.
And Mr. Rojas, where do you live and work?
I live at 1416 Briar Forest Circle in Edmond, Oklahoma. I work at OU Health Sciences Center in Oklahoma City.
All right, sir. How long have you worked for OU Health Sciences Center?
I've been at OU Health Sciences Center since 2005.
All right, sir. Your Honor, at this time, we would move admission of Plaintiff's Exhibit 4730, which is his curriculum vitae. It's in the book I gave you.
Copy for us, please.
I thought you all had copies.
I have no objection to its admission.
Exhibit 4730 will be admitted to the evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor. And Dr. Rojas, you have a copy of that
I do?
CV there at your disposal. Did you create that document?
Yes, sir.
And certainly, I'm sure you have not memorized it. Feel free to look at it if you need to. But here's what I'd like you to do. Will you walk the court through your education and your employment history and what you've been doing up until the present time as a professional?
Absolutely. In 1992, I began work at a residential treatment center for addiction, while at the same time attending junior college. And throughout my time in that addiction treatment facility, I worked my way up to a clinician, continued to pursue higher education, got a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and then went to the University of Georgia. In 1999, pursued a doctorate.
What is your Bachelor of Arts in?
Psychology.
And what year did you receive that and from where?
1994 from the University of South Florida.
And what is your Master of Arts in and where did you receive that from?
Counselor education, also at the University of South Florida.
And then you got a PhD?
I did.
And what year did you finish that?
2003 at the University of Georgia.
And what field?
That was in counseling psychology.
All right, sir. Can you just walk through your experience in the field of treatment of addiction, please, sir?
Well, like I said, I got an entry-level job in '92, worked my way up, continued my studies and my education. I actually came to Oklahoma in 2003 because at the time they had a chemical dependency fellowship program for psychologists. And I interviewed and was accepted and had a wonderful experience with a number of mentors and loved Oklahoma, so I decided to stay.
Well, we're glad that you did. Can you tell the court about your postgraduate education and training?
Well, again, the focus was chemical dependency, so for 6 months I spent that time at the VA Medical Center. And then for the other 6 months I spent at the Department of Corrections with a heavy focus on addiction.
All right, sir. And what is your current title at the OU Health Science Center?
I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences.
Would it be fair to say that your specialty is addiction and the treatment of addiction?
Yes, it would. Up until 2018, I held the highest credential in psychology for the treatment of substance use disorders. And I have a grant, a workforce development grant, where I help train the workforce in Oklahoma on addiction issues and treatment.
And have you received honors and awards since you started your professional career?
A few.
I see those on page 2.
Yeah.
You mind telling the court about some of those?
Let's see. Well, the Gordon Deckard Award is our sort of department award for excellence, sustained excellence in teaching endeavors, and so that's sort of the one everyone wants because it comes with a cash prize.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
Distinguished psychologist citation from my colleagues at the Oklahoma Psychological Association. Outstanding instructor, that would be from the residents in the Department of Psychiatry. And then there's a Distinguished Early Career Award in Psychology.
And tell the court, please, about your board and practice certification.
Well, I have a certification, I don't have a board, but the certification was, as you see there, in the treatment of alcohol and other psychoactive substance use disorders from the American Psychological Association.
And can you tell us about your licenses?
Licensed alcohol and drug counselor since 2005. I believe I originally got that credential in Florida as a certified addictions professional in 98 or 99. And then a health service psychologist in Oklahoma since 2004.
And looking at page 4 of your CV, I see publications, peer-reviewed publications. I don't want to go through every one of those, but it looks like you've done a number of those in the field of addiction. Is that correct?
Correct. Obviously, I'm interested in addictions, but also how addictions and other conditions co-occur. It's a particular interest of mine. And more specifically, how that might look in healthcare professionals and executives.
And I see on page 5, it lists presentations that you have made. I'm not going to go through every one of those, but have you done a number of presentations in the field of addiction and treatment of addiction?
Yes, I have.
And let's go to your job. Correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like there are at least 3 things that you do. Number 1, do you teach?
Yes, sir, I do teach several courses in interviewing and motivational interviewing, one of the evidence-based treatments for substance use disorders. And I teach a systems of psychotherapy course. I teach an elective addiction medicine elective for medical students. And generally try to incorporate an understanding of addiction really in any course that I'm teaching.
Okay, and I see commencing on page 6 through about page 17, I see a number of things. Are those courses that you have taught over the years?
Courses or lectures or presentations at professional associations or other groups.
And
one of my joys is presenting to Parents Helping Parents in Edmond and Norman.
And why do you do that?
I do that because I think it's so important to understand the nature of addiction and what it is and what it does. And, you know, there's so much stigma associated with addiction that anytime we can help educate and help a family member understand, we know that that's going to help increase the chances of that person maybe getting help, of having a supportive sort of family system, which we know is important in the outcome.
And are you part of the med school?
Yes, I'm in the Department of Psychiatry
Okay.
and Behavioral Sciences.
All right, sir. And how long have you been teaching after you got out of school?
Well, I began teaching when I started there, so 2015, or 2005, sorry.
Okay. And let's talk about the second area, research. Do you do research in the field of addiction and addiction treatment?
Yes, I do research in that area, usually among healthcare professionals and executives.
Okay. And how long have you been doing research in addiction and addiction treatment?
Probably since 2010.
Okay.
Somewhere in that time frame.
And the third thing I've noted, do you actually treat patients who suffer from addiction?
Absolutely, it's a great passion of mine.
How long have you been doing that?
Oh goodness, if we go back to before the days I was a licensed psychologist, I was doing that as a master's level provider in Florida for, I believe, since 1999.
And do you treat patients who suffer from opioid addiction?
Some, yes.
And how long have you treated patients who suffer from opioid addiction?
I would say from the beginning of my practice at OU Health Sciences Center.
Can you tell the court what Arcadia Trails is?
Arcadia Trails is a new treatment center in Oklahoma that we're fortunate to have, and fortunately Integris, the largest health system in Oklahoma, made a decision to commit itself to the treatment of this condition and the comorbid conditions that co-occur with this condition. And they've also committed to doing that with a length of stay that we think is very critical, sort of this 90-day window model. And they committed themselves to having the right people there, the people that they needed to treat these various conditions. So I'm really excited it actually opened today.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. In a strange twist of fate, the same day this trial starts, did Arcadia Trails open up?
Yes, sir, it did.
Tell the court your role in this new treatment facility, Arcadia Trails.
So I was very honored 7 years ago. I was very honored to come and talk about addiction treatment and what it should look like if we could sort of do it in an effective way. And I was the chair of a clinical committee, a group of individuals with over 100 years of recovery experience who we really mapped out, how you can recover or engage recovery from addiction and other conditions that commonly co-occur.
And were you asked to do something for Arcadia Trails?
I'm sorry?
Yes, what did Arcadia Trails ask you to design?
Well, essentially to chair the committee that would put together the clinical DNA for that program.
And
Its philosophy, its model of care, the interventions we implemented, the people that needed to be there, the training they needed to have, and a commitment to really involving the families.
And did you do that for them?
I believe I did.
You're the architect of that?
Well, I'd say I'm one of the architects of that.
Okay.
Many people went into putting that together, but I was fortunate to be the chair of a clinical committee, and the committee and I argued over that, were passionate about that, talked about that for many years, and are really proud that today we can open the doors and offer hope to Oklahomans.
Are you recognized in this state as an expert in addiction and addiction treatment?
I believe I am. My phone and my email seem to constant messages and inquiries about what to do or what help an individual might seek. So if I went by that and that I've been asked to join projects that were very significant and very important, I would say the answer is yes.
Do you consider that to be your area of expertise, addiction and addiction treatment?
I do.
And addiction to opioids?
Right.
And do you know Commissioner Terry White, who's seated at my table?
I do.
And tell the court what you have done working with Commissioner White over the years.
Well, it was Commissioner White who graciously invited me to provide my ideas on addiction treatment to a group of individuals. These were individuals who had very close ties to the nature of addiction and its effects on families, and they were very passionate about doing something and making a change in our state and coming up with a model for the treatment of addiction.
Was that needed?
Desperately.
Your Honor, at this time, we would offer Dr. Rojas as an expert in addiction and the treatment of addiction. I have no objection.
Dr. Rojas will be recognized as next.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Rojas, have I asked you to testify to the judge in this case about addiction and opioid addiction treatment?
Yes, sir, you did.
And have you reviewed some materials to do so in this case?
Yes, sir, I have.
And let's do this. First, before we go into addiction, can you just tell us what are opioids?
Opioids are a type of medication that are designed to treat acute and chronic pain, and they do so effectively.
And the other term we've been throwing around all day is the word addiction. Can you tell the court, what does addiction mean?
Well, I'm happy to do that, Your Honor. I'm going to have to stand up and...
You have permission to do that.
Thank you, sir.
May we, Your Honor, display a couple of slides that I don't think they have an objection to. We're going to display the brain slides first. All right. So as soon as we get that up, Dr. Rojas,
what I'd like you to do is explain what addiction is and how the neurobiology of it, and how it works on the human brain.
I'm happy to do that, and I'm able to do that because of the thousands of stories that I've heard over the years from family members, from patients on this process. And so, Your Honor, I've got a little bit of graphic envy right now. This is not as fancy as you've seen earlier, so, but this grainy picture will suffice. So, Mr. Whitten, before I start with the tale of addiction, I want to start with normal brain function.
Okay?
Because it's important to realize how we're sort of wired to function in our world effectively. And I think from that understanding, we can begin to see why addiction is a disorder so devastating to these processes, these human instincts we have that are so important and vital in our survival and our ability to be productive citizens. So I have a picture of a sort of a normal brain, and here I'm just going to draw a line between two major parts of the brain. And earlier, Your Honor, when you asked that we conduct ourselves professionally and civilly and all those other things, we're able to do that hopefully because we can regulate our emotions, we can understand that everyone in this room is probably very passionate about what's going on. But that, because of this higher order, this is what makes us human. This is what allows us to regulate our instincts, control our behavior, rein in our emotions. You know, we all have instincts, and this bottom part, the limbic system part, is really responsible for behaviors that are tied to our survival, our safety, meeting our sexual needs, meeting our needs for food and hydration. And so when these two parts work well in the human animal, you know, we are rational beings, and first and foremost, we're rational beings. And this ability to use our intellect to regulate these instincts and urges is very important to our ability to function successfully. And we see examples in everyday life where someone's emotions get the best of them and they might do something or say something that they might regret. But this part of our brain is what allows us to be here today. This part of our brain is what allows us to think about the information that's being presented. This part of our brain is what allows us to critically think, to set goals, to pursue things, to delay our gratification. You know, these are very important things that allow us to function in society. And so very broadly, these two parts of the brain interact every day, all the time. And if you have teenagers, you know, by the time you've controlled your impulses and controlled thoughts for an entire day, by the time you get home, your loved ones might realize that you might have a more diminished capacity here, that you might say yes where you would otherwise say no because we're tired. This takes a lot of energy to regulate our behavior, to control our conduct, to fight back impulses. And so, so I think it's important that you understand this part before we move into what begins to happen when a person develops addiction. Next slide.
Next slide, Mike. Thank you.
All right. So again, prefrontal cortex, this is essentially what makes us humans. And then we have the limbic system. This is a more primitive part of the brain, as we talked about earlier. Now, all individuals are not equal when it comes to the risk of addiction. And why is that? Well, because for some individuals, they have a family history of addiction. And when you have a family history of addiction, that increases your risk of developing that condition. So I have patients who grew up in a home with alcoholism, and they made a decision to not drink. So rational decision. They appreciated that there was a risk associated with it, and they made a decision not to drink alcohol. Very wise decision for them. What they could not have anticipated, though, is in their 40s or 50s going and having a procedure and being put on opioid medications. And that those opioid medications would have a profound effect, or different effect, if you will, in this part of the brain. I'm very thankful, Your Honor. I have an appropriate response to opioids. I get sick, nauseous, groggy. It's a terrible experience, and consequently, 2 or 3 pills into that prescription, I'm done. I don't want to do it anymore. I'll just gut it out. The experience of my patients who have a family history.
Excuse me, Your Honor, it would make it easier on me if we could have a question and answer session instead of just a lecture. That would make it easier to know where the questions are going.
My question was explain how opioid addiction works in the brain, and I thought that's what he was doing.
I'll allow Dr. Rojas to continue answering this question, and then moving forward, we'll ask Mr. Wood to ask more specific questions.
Thank you, Judge.
So, now, this is an individual with a family history who perhaps made the right decision not to drink alcohol, ended up on a prescription opioid, could not have predicted, could not have anticipated that perhaps their limbic system, this part that is associated with pleasure and euphoria, would have a more robust response to that medication. And so when you interview people with addiction, it's very common to hear this same sort of narrative, that when they encountered this opioid medication, or a opioid medication, that it seemed to waken up, or it seemed to alleviate more than physical pain, maybe psychological pain, things they had struggled with. And that is what I call sort of the honeymoon phase, that in this part of the addictive process, the individual really comes to have an experience that is more robust than the average person, that makes them feel better perhaps than the average person, that may take away their fears and anxieties, that might numb emotional pain in a way that they had never experienced. And so this is sort of that period in time where the individual feels like they have found something that brings them peace, comfort, serenity. And if you have that without ingesting substances, you should be very thankful, because that's not the experiences of individuals, not of my patients, who really have a lot of angst and dread, fear and anxiety about just being in their own minds and hearts and skin. And so when we talk about all risks not being equal, I think the 2 points is some patients with a family history are at higher risk. Some patients with psychiatric conditions are at higher risk of developing problems. Individuals with trauma are at risk of developing problems. There are certain personality types, people that struggle with impulse control. So the risk is not equal, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge that, to make that sort of known, that you do not carry the same general population risk. And so, and then I think that there are some medications that are so highly addictive that the properties of that substance really can sort of begin to trump these other kind of factors, these psychological and emotional factors that individuals have. And so this is sort of another group that I see, people that, and when I say people that I see, Your Honor, we're talking about some of the brightest and accomplished individuals in the state of Oklahoma, in medicine, in law, in all kinds of professions. These are bright individuals. And so, and because of that, they are baffled to find themselves in this situation that they've addicted to substances. So the risk is not equal when it comes to addiction because of family history and other factors. The risk is not equal sometimes because of the nature of the medication and its power to produce a euphoric response in the individual. Could I have the
Next slide, please, Mike. What does this next slide, what do you intend to show the court in this next slide?
So if we look at the first part, which is this sort of honeymoon experience that the person might have, the drug doing something for them beyond alleviating physical pain, perhaps alleviating emotional and other kinds of pain and anguish. Then the second part of this process is really an individual beginning to learn the relationship with this substance. How much, how often, by which method do I use this? What other substances might feel good with this substance that I'm using? They begin to, this is a period in which they perceive that they have control, but they really are not. They're starting to lose control. They begin to develop rationalizations for why they didn't show up, or why they didn't do certain things that they were obligated to do. When the consequences begin to pile up, they begin to use sort of their intellect and reasoning to explain away this process. Work stress, the job's asking me for too much, the job is too demanding. They begin to rationalize this process that they're getting into with their addictive substance. And we all know, I hope we all know, the wonderful impact of a honeymoon period in any relationship. It can really sustain that relationship over a period of time. And so in this phase, the individual is really recollecting sort of the more positive aspect of what that drug is doing, and they're sort of explaining away or de-emphasizing some of the consequences related to those substances, despite, Your Honor, having intellectual knowledge. So So you could have this knowledge and still be susceptible to this process.
Is this a time period, doctor, where these patients in this time period you're talking about, where they make decisions that are actually very damaging to themselves and their families?
They absolutely are, and you know, with certain substances, let's take for example alcohol, this process might unfold over 10 years, 15 years, a long extended period. But there are some substances that by their very nature, their very powerful nature, can collapse the window of time. And so my patients tell me they knew they were in trouble in weeks. They knew they were in trouble in months, not years, not a decade, very rapidly.
Doctor, are opioids one of those highly addictive
Absolutely,
substances?
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
is that just a fact that opioids are highly addictive?
I think that's been said here in a variety of ways today.
But from your testimony and your experience, your education, your training, is that a fact that opioids are highly addictive substances?
That is a fact. That is a fact that patients will tell you. That is a fact that families will tell you. That they seemingly have lost their loved ones in a period of a short period of time in this process. And so now, Your Honor, if you notice, in the initial, the broader bands, the broader arrows were on the top. Regulatory mechanisms, our ability to regulate conduct, regulate urges. Now you see a sort of shift. This is what you hear called the hijacking effect, or that this drug sort of takes over a person's life. Now notice the larger bands are in the limbic system, in the area of the limbic system. Now remember, this is the appetite area, this is the survival area, this is the part of the brain that tells us that we must do certain things to survive. And at this point, what is beginning to happen, and what has happened to the individual, is that they now need those substances to function. They need those substances to show up at work, they need those substances to conduct surgery, they need those substances to dispense medicines in pharmacy. They are required. And when they are not in the individual's body, they become sick, they have withdrawal symptoms.
Doctor, let me interrupt you, but you mentioned your patients were well educated. Some of the best educated people in the state of Oklahoma. They were raised well, they had morals. They knew better than to do these self-destructive things. Why did they do them anyway?
Mr. Whitten, some of them had specific training in the nature of chemicals and how chemicals interact with the body. That's probably the hardest thing to explain to family members and even patients themselves, is this is nothing about this is a rational process. And in fact, sometimes that higher level thinking delays treatment because the individuals think, I can get this, I can turn this around. You know, I can do this, or I can do that, or I can make a promise. I've had healthcare providers come up with a taper schedule that they were going to follow, only to find themselves by that age not being able to follow that schedule.
And these are people that knew better.
These are people that are trained, that are healthcare providers themselves. So this is not a rational or logical process. These are fundamental changes structurally and chemically in the brain that render an individual addicted, enslaved, forever changed by this process because there's no cure.
Permanent?
Permanent.
This
There's no cure for
this condition is permanent.
This condition is permanent. Now, fortunately, we have recovery. Fortunately, we have therapies. Fortunately, we have medicines, things that can put the person on the path of recovery. But how many times have we heard somebody be 10 years sober, 20 years sober, and dead the next day? This is a life sentence. And in treatment, we say that you get a stay of execution every day, provided you do certain things, provided you go to meetings, provided you go to therapy, provided you engage in recovery. And so this walk that they're on, them and their families and their communities, is for the rest of their lives. And this is a chronic and relapsing disorder. And so
Is relapsing?
One thing I can tell you, Mr. Williams, is that, you know, when an alcoholic patient relapses, typically they're not going to die. They're going to have a chance to kind of get them back on plan and get them back to a better place. The scary thing with opioids, and you hear this a lot, right, is that when they relapse, there's the possibility they could end up dead.
Why? What is different about opioids versus other drugs?
I think the intensity of that urge and that craving, I think, is one part of it. The intense euphoria that they feel under the influence of that drug. I've heard people describe it almost as the warm hand of God touching them. As a Christian, I can't imagine that kind of statement. But these are powerful words that they use to describe how they felt. Some will tell you they felt for the first time more under the influence of opioids. And that's a hard concept, Your Honor, to really grasp. So now we're sort of in that vicious state where now what you're trying to do is avoid withdrawal symptoms, avoid feeling sick, and trying to get through each day, trying to function. There's no more euphoria. It's just a vicious cycle from here on out. Now, in the next slide.
No, next one.
Well, I can comment on this.
Now, let's wait for that, the two slides. There you go.
There you go. So, Your Honor, I started with, this is normal. This is where most of us are.
On the left-hand side of the page.
On the left-hand side. This is 85% of us. If you believe the number of prevalence of addiction, that's 10 to 15%. It's 85% of us. We probably are never going to know this process. We might see it in a loved one. We might struggle to understand it. But fortunately, for the majority of us, we might never know what this experience feels like. The problem is that from this frame of reference, we're passing judgment on this group, on a group that in many ways is brain injured. And in many ways, they are affected by a disease that disrupts the very thing that makes them human. The ability to control their conduct, the ability to be socially productive and helpful, and contribute to their community. Survival instinct, the survival instinct that if I faced death, I would do everything I could to survive, and yet they're doing something that may ultimately result in their death. So these are deeply ingrained human instincts that are trumped or that are overridden by the addictive process. It happens in humans, but it also happens in animal models. And so, when we talk about stigma and its role, it's this group saying, why do you do these things? Why don't you think better, or act better, or use willpower, or use self-control? And Your Honor, before you get here, you're over here. So you have that same societal view that these people are weak, they're broken, they're defective, they're unworthy. To an extreme, we might think they're deserving what happens to them. There's a social psychological construct called belief in a just world. We believe bad things happen to bad people, that their behaviors are the reason that bad things happen to them. So I'm always eager to talk about this message of stigma and that these people are sick and they deserve treatment. But unfortunately, we still see them as weak and immoral. And that to me is sad, and that's part of why I'm here today. I really want that as this proceeds, I really want folks to understand what's going on here. These are all of us have these human instincts. And these folks are not bad. It's just that the behaviors we see are coming from a brain that is fundamentally changed, drastically changed. The mother that takes opioids while carrying. The maternal instinct is overridden. That's how that happens. A young man that plows into a pharmacy. These are desperate acts by individuals who are in the vicious grip of addiction. So I wanted to contribute that piece to this as you move forward.
Your Honor, may I approach for just a moment?
Yes, you may.
May I flip sides with you, Doctor? So many of us in this courtroom, many folks watching on television, we've raised kids. So our children, they grow up in the first grade, maybe through college, and they have a normal brain. Don't we all have an experience where we're telling our kids, do your homework, don't steal, don't lie, don't cheat, and we know how those children, usually they do the right thing. Is that because they have a normal brain?
Yeah. They're able to learn, they're able to listen, but they also have a brain that's developing in this part, which is the part that is more emotional based, rationally based. And so those of you that have teenagers can probably attest to it's a hair-pulling daily ordeal probably because they do things and say things and act in ways that make us scratch our heads.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. I don't want to say lose hair, but
5 of them.
yeah.
But for those of us who have raised a child that got addicted, and their brain has changed. Did I hear you right? The chemistry of their brain changes, right?
Yes, sir.
Did I hear you say that it actually was like being damaged, brain damage? All right, so now we have that same child, the good boy that you know, the good girl that you know, or maybe it's your mother or your sister. They get addicted. Now they don't act the way that they normally did, right?
I don't believe they could act the way they did.
Dr. Rojas, please sit back down. I'll follow up with that.
Okay.
Is based on your experience, all of your experience and your education and your training, is that something that the American public does not understand? How people, good people, moral people, people that they know, change and they start doing things that are dangerous and bad. Does the American public understand this based on your experience?
Excuse me, Your Honor, I
don't
don't know
think-
that Dr. Rojas intends to speak for the American public.
I'll rephrase it.
Thank you, Reggie.
The population in general that you interface as a professional in this field, when they come to you with an addicted child or loved one, do they understand this?
I don't believe they do. It's, remember, from their perspective, reasoning, intellect trumps everything.
Well,
I raised them better. They'll say things like, I've raised them better. They know better. Their father died of alcoholism. They've seen the destruction. They're grasping at intellectual reasons to understand something that's not.
well, they look the same, right? If it's a son or a daughter or mother or father, they look the same, right?
Well, actually, what families tell me is that their loved one is unrecognizable to them.
By their
Sometimes
behavior.
even physically.
Yeah.
But certainly psychologically and emotionally, that their loved one, that they've seen their loved one sort of slip away.
Well, Dr. Rojas, you probably heard opening statement. One of the reasons I wanted to ask you questions so that you could explain it to the court. This is a nuisance case, and we're talking in this case about how to abate or how to fix the nuisance. So let me start with a couple of questions, just to be certain. Is opioid addiction difficult to treat?
Yes, sir, it is.
Is opioid addiction expensive to treat?
Yes, sir, it is.
Let's talk about a dirty little secret that I have some knowledge of. 30-day rehabs. So your kid gets addicted to, let's say, an opioid. So you send him to a 30-day rehab. Those are pretty expensive, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
And is it your experience that most people that you come into contact with, they think, hey, 30 days full time away from the family, that ought to do the trick. 30-day rehab should heal my child. Is that true?
If you don't understand what's going on, you might believe that.
Well, what's the efficacy of a 30-day rehab today when we're talking about something like opioid addiction?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is if you've ever worked in a residential treatment center, what you can clearly and visibly see in individuals who are addicted is that by the 45th day is when you typically see them sort of coming back online. They'll tell us that, you know, much of treatment is education and literacy and learning, and then, you know, under 30 days, you really don't have an individual who's feeling well enough, who's thinking straight enough, who's sleeping well enough, who's managing well enough to fully participate. They're unwell. And so if you work in these settings, you literally see that every day counts and every week counts. And but it is a starting point. And so, and when you factor in that many of these individuals will have other comorbid conditions, you know, sometimes you need more than 30 just to get the diagnosis down. And so, and not all treatment centers are created equally. And that's why I'm pleased with the Arcadia Trails program, is we put the right people in that facility working together.
Well, what length of time do you recommend try to get at Arcadia Trails now?
My experience has been that you need 90 at least, that you need to be able to have them contained. Remember, that go is driving them to do a behavior that is life-threatening. You got to get them in a safe environment. You got to get them in a sober environment. You've got to get them contained and protected from themselves, which is a baffling prospect that we would have to protect an individual from themselves. But this is exactly what has to happen.
So that child.
Now,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
I
ahead.
told you about the family members that sometimes, the last person I can remember, well, can we go on our cruise first? No. Like you wouldn't, this is where I get upset with this idea of comparing it to other conditions like cancer. I've never heard anybody be diagnosed with cancer who said, well, can we go on a cruise first, or can we have our family annual outing first, and then we'll get down to wherever we're going to take them. But again, with addiction, it's, well, can we postpone it? Can we delay it? Can we, there's a failure to appreciate the life and death urgency of this condition.
Does that make it more difficult to treat?
Absolutely makes it more difficult, because oftentimes the patient won't appreciate the problem, may not appreciate that they need the help, and it's expensive for families. And a lot of times other families say, well, if they're not interested in getting better, then I don't want to fork out the resources to get them better.
Well, let's talk about something you did touch on, because this is another feature that I find interesting about opioid addiction. You mentioned cancer. Is it your experience that most people, if they get a disease, cancer, diabetes, AIDS, whatever, they're eager to seek treatment?
It's urgent.
They are cooperative with the treatment.
Yeah. Cancer has a distinctive pain.
Let's talk about the brain on the right. An opioid addicted individual, with this change in the brain chemistry, with this damage to the brain, do they appreciate the fact that they need treatment?
Absolutely not.
Do they cooperate with the treatment?
No.
Do you have problems both getting patients to cooperate and get into rehab, as well as getting them to stay in rehab?
Well, again, in my population that I see with healthcare professionals, the boards have tremendous leverage, and it's that leverage that helps us get people into treatment. It's not a recognition on their own that they have a problem, because addiction by definition impairs one's ability to see the scope of the problem. And so, so they have to be leveraged sometimes, they have to be convinced, they have to be court-ordered. Rarely will folks with addiction believe that they actually need it.
That's pretty.
Now, once they're in treatment, the light comes on, they begin to understand some dynamics and some patterns and some ways that they've hurt the people that they love and the people that they work with. Then it becomes more clear, then there's more insight, there's more connecting sort of the dots. But in this graph right here, Mr. Whitten, this is going to be baffling to those of you that don't get this, but using drugs is the solution to life's problems.
You mean in
Not
their mind?
the problem. Yeah. Using substances is the solution to life's problems.
The very drug that's harming them and
Killing them, stealing their life away, sometimes taking their liberty, taking their career. They do not perceive that that is the problem. The problem is the spouse, the meddling employer, the unappreciative institution that they might work for. So there are a number of challenges to get the people engaged in recovery, yet we know when they do, wonderful things happen.
Well, let's talk about the person that goes to say the 90-day rehab, and they complete it and they do everything you want them to do. Are they free to go? Are they cured?
No, that's another thing I think we need to change in the treatment of addiction. This is a chronic illness, and we need to adopt a chronic management type problem. Therapy, meetings, social support, all of these things. This is a lifestyle change that they're going to have to make. And so, regrettably, people go off to treatment and they feel like it was a discrete sort of event. They got a treatment and now they can continue. But if we're doing our job, we're helping them and their families understand that this is a chronic illness. It requires chronic management, and everybody has a part in that recovery, family members included.
So, just taking, say, for example, an 18-year-old kid that gets addicted, are you saying to this court for a fact that kid has an injury that is chronic and will haunt him the rest of his life?
Yeah, he has a condition that he will have for the rest of his life that will require him to do certain things to stay in remission from this condition. But he always has the risk because of life stress or a surgery or some other problem that he might once again pick up those medicines and it could be fatal for him.
Doctor, some of this seems counterintuitive. So you've got a kid that, stays clean for a year or two, and perhaps thinks he is cured. Are you saying that relapse with opioid addiction is the norm, or is it the exception?
I think we think of addiction as a chronic and relapsing condition. And relapse is certainly always possible.
And is that recognized in the field that you practice in every day as a medical fact? You're not speculating.
No, I'm not speculating. We have to adopt a chronic disease management model for this. I don't think there'd be any disagreement about that because the risk always remains.
And you mentioned the stigma. Please tell Judge Balkman what you mean by this stigma that is associated with opioid addiction.
Well, it's a societally sanctioned view that, when an individual develops addiction, they did something to cause that. And what I would say is, yes, they did something in that they picked up that medication. Certainly they did something. What they were not in control of, Your Honor, was how that medicine would impact and influence their brain, how that medicine would give them such a euphoric response that they would find themselves mentally obsessing over that. They could not have predicted that. And so I don't think they control that. And I think for us on this side, on the right side, that's just unimaginable because control issues are so part of our experience as humans. And so, and yet it's critical to understand that. This is not about control. This is about sickness. This is about a disease process.
Well, you may have heard me make this statement in the opening, that addiction is sort of a tale of two diseases or two types of diseases. Did you hear that in the opening? Because I want to ask you about that.
I don't recall hearing it, but I'm hearing it now.
Well, for example, the ordinary citizen has cancer. Is there any, generally speaking, is there any stigma associated with that?
No, I don't. I think the typical response is support and helpfulness and kindness and compassion, and that's. We don't do a lot of blaming and shaming when it comes to cancer.
But in the field of opioid addiction, you do this every day. You work in this field every day, right?
I do.
You teach it, you treat it, and you research it, right?
Correct.
So let me ask you this. When someone gets opioid addicted, generally speaking, how are they treated?
Well, I can tell you the experiences of my patients. Their doctors are angry with them. They get lectured, they get shamed, they get scolded. How could you do this? They get cut off. They get sort of labeled as a second-class citizen. They get fired. And remember, the patient themselves has to come to terms with this, right? They say things like, how did I let this happen? Why couldn't I have done X? Why couldn't I have done Z? And so no one is harder on someone who's addicted than the addicted individual. Trust me. I hear the regret. I hear the recognition of the pain that they see in their parents' faces, but unfortunately, there's work to be done, and that sometimes can be a great obstacle.
Well, sometimes we parents don't understand this and inappropriately are harsh with our addicted children.
Absolutely.
And even maybe parents with their spouses or siblings or whatever. Doctor.
Excuse me, Your Honor, that wasn't a question, which is a problem we've been having.
I'm sorry,
That wasn't a question. It's a problem we've been having, just a dialogue.
I'll withdraw it.
Thank you.
Doctor, are these opioid addicted individuals bad people doing bad things?
No, Mr. Wade, I think I've answered that in any number of ways. This addiction is a terrible illness, and if you've never gotten it, thank whoever you worship. because it is a terrible road for the individuals that have to walk it. They would have never foreseen it. They're surprised to be there. They struggle to come to terms with it and the implications of it for themselves and their families. And yet, because of recovery, that pain and misery becomes an important message. This is what I get excited about, that the doctors and the nurses and the pharmacists that engage recovery are wonderful allies, because they can identify patients, they can talk to these patients, they can encourage these patients, they can give these patients hope. They are a living example that there's a way out of this darkness. And I'm so thankful for that. And I'm proud to be part of that work that contributes to that.
Doctor, this loss of control that you have talked about, do you have a video that you can show the court that kind of explains how this loss of control works?
I do, and I want to tell you that, I think part of being an expert is listening to the narratives of your patients and their families and trying to really hear what they're telling you about this experience and this process. And one individual who is in successful recovery shared a short video clip, 5 minutes, Your Honor, of this process that I've talked about, it beautifully captured. And so, with your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to.
Yeah, before you do, have counsel come to this, I want to ask you about the video.
It's exhibit S4600. And before we play it, just to make sure, you've seen it,
Yes,
right?
sir. Yes, sir.
You use it now in your practice to explain how this works?
Yes, sir. I think it nicely captures these 3 parts that I talked about, this honeymoon stage, the learning and memory phase, and then the avoidance of withdrawal symptoms and negative affect. I think it captures that beautifully.
All right. Your Honor, with your permission, we will show it.
Yeah, permission to publish states 4600.
Dr. Rojas, explain to Judge Balkman why you feel this video is representative of opioid addiction in your patients.
Your Honor, I think it captures beautifully, or unfortunately, it captures this process of sort of this honeymoon and this euphoric response. The consequences that begin to happen, if you caught that he wanted to kick the substance and yet continued to do it, this love-hate relationship, but that the euphoric recall and the euphoria produced by this substance sort of kept him at it. And certainly at the end there, you see where sometimes I'll find some of my patients at the end of their ropes, they're defeated, they're deflated. As a clinician, I know that can be a good thing because they're ready to receive maybe the message of treatment and recovery. But there are those who feel like they have failed to such an extent that they're unworthy to even live life. And so it's a scary time. It can be beautiful in that they can receive help, but it could also be a time that in their despair and in their dejected state, they're death welcoming. They don't want to do this, and they certainly don't want to have their family members watch them do this.
Dr. Rojas, are opioids as dangerous as a cobra?
Excuse me, Your Honor, I don't know that he's qualified himself in terms of cobras.
Call out the question.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Given that I don't know much about cobras other than they're fatal,
Would you prefer rattlesnakes? Since we have those
probably a
here.
little more familiar with rattlesnakes.
We don't have cobras here, so, well, first, let's start with that. If you're going to pick up a snake, should you know the difference between a rattlesnake and a garden snake?
You should.
Are opioids highly dangerous, just like the venom from a rattlesnake?
I think they're highly dangerous and fatal.
I've never been bit by a rattlesnake, and I don't know what it would feel like to die of rattlesnake venom, but the death from opioid addiction, is that pleasant?
I wouldn't imagine it is.
The life living as an opioid addicted patient, is that pleasant?
Not until you find recovery.
So your patients, every one of your patients, where did they become addicted? Where did they get their opioids from?
Well, in my group, the majority of them were going to get it through an injury or something that they required pain relief for.
Now, there was a video shown by my friend Mr. Ottaway in his opening statement. Jansen was kind enough to make a video they show to some children. Did you see that video?
I did see that video.
And so let's first start. If you've got children or teenagers or adolescents who are already experimenting with opioids, how does a video like that help with the addicted brain?
Well, what I was struck by is this same idea that if we give individuals the facts, that if we teach them the risk, that in and of itself can help prevent problems. The problem in the adolescent, remember when we were talking about brain development, that limbic system that's tied to pleasure and euphoria and curiosity and sensation seeking and risk taking, I mean, that's the part of the brain that's developing in that period of their lives. So unfortunately, they might hear a warning as an invitation, that something risky might be exhilarating or something risky might be exciting. And it just has to do with that stage of their development. So I was struck by the idea that just teaching you the facts about something, telling you that this is dangerous and this is bad, I think that's great. I think understanding your audience and your population is important.
Well,
because for some, they might watch that and have a sense of curiosity.
when does the decision-making part of the brain, the frontal lobe, in human beings, when does it become fully developed? What age?
Probably in our mid-20s.
Okay. And for young people who don't have a fully developed frontal lobe, based upon your experience and your training, how do these one-shot messages like that video affect these young people?
Well, as I recollect a patient of mine saying, when I heard those warnings, I figured I was the exception. And that was his take on that. That was the warning for the general population, but not him.
Hypothetically, doctor, if a drug manufacturer were to understate the risks of addiction, does it make it okay later to make a little film like that?
Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not qualified in that.
Objection sustained.
Thank you.
There was one more slide I think you were going to show the court, the Venn diagram. Mike, do you mind? This is part of exhibit, all the slides, Your Honor, including this one, or one exhibit. It's S4125. So, do you mind explaining to Judge Bachman what this is and what it means?
So, Your Honor, this is an image, if you will. If we wanted to look at the comorbidities, the problems that can coexist with addiction, this is an image that sort of captures that we know that individuals with addiction can also suffer from comorbid mental illness, that both people with addiction and psychiatric illness, when you ask them about adversity in childhood or adverse life events, traumatic experiences, they seem to endorse higher rates of these. And that for some of these individuals, actually a large percentage, some 60% to 75% of them, that they have sort of developed a way of living, a personality style, that they might be sensation-seeking, risk-taking, and so I'm thinking of a particular cluster group, cluster Bs, who really end up in cemeteries and treatment centers. And so there's something about the way they seek sensation, the way they seek excitement, usually in unhealthy ways. And so this image was an image I created to help patients and families understand that by the time I'm seeing them, we're not just talking about addiction anymore. We might be talking about the comorbid depression. We might be talking about symptoms related to trauma, and that perhaps the role those medicines might be playing is self-medicating some of those wounds. And so to just treat the addiction would be a third of the plan that that individual would need, or a fourth. And we can have no expectation that with a fourth of a treatment plan that a person's going to get better. We have to target these areas. And actually, patients and families understand this message. They get it, that when you have multiple comorbidities, multiple diagnoses, that the most effective treatment is to get them diagnosed and treat each of them, preferably simultaneously.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. Let me ask you a couple of follow-up questions. I see your names on here, so you came up with this, published it?
As a postdoc, yes.
Okay, great. So we have one circle here. This represents addiction, right? We have one circle here that represents psychiatric illness, right? So that could be any number of things.
You know,
I see you nodding your head, but you need to say yes or no.
yes.
Okay, so for example, psychiatric illnesses, you put a few examples down. Mood disorders, anxiety, psychotic disorders. Those are just examples.
Those
right?
are just examples.
Now we go to the third circle, trauma. So this could be any number of types of trauma: abuse, neglect, wounds, grief, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Having an addicted parent, having a mentally ill parent.
Yes, these are just examples. There are many, right?
Correct.
But those are the three groups, correct?
Correct.
Now what you've done is you've merged those in here. So let me ask about that. Now, we take our fellow members of our society like we find them. Everybody in this courtroom comes as they are made,
Yeah.
right? People may have, as you said, in the addiction circle, a predisposition to addiction. Is that what you're talking about in that
Yes,
circle?
that's what I'm talking about.
People may have some kind of psychiatric illness. People may have a trauma. So, is it, any one of those circles cause problems?
Absolutely.
Fair enough?
Fair enough.
But if you have two of them, for example, you have a genetic predisposition to addiction, but you also have some kind of psychiatric illness, is that harder to treat?
Yes, it is.
Or if you have a different two, if you have addiction and trauma, is that harder to treat?
Yes, it is.
Or
Not just harder to treat, harder for the patient to come to accept it, because there's stigma associated with addiction, there's stigma associated with mental illness, there's stigma associated with having traumatic experiences. And so I like to think of this as a compounding of stigma, levels of stigma.
And you mentioned that maybe 15% in addiction in general, people may have some kind of predisposition towards addiction, right? Did I say that right? Or if I didn't,
Well, the prevalence of addiction is about 10 to 15% of the general population.
Got it.
What we see in that group is that a large majority of them will have a sort of family history of addiction.
so if you're in the larger group, you have none of these pre-existing genetic factors. None of your parents were addicts. Okay. But you have trauma or you have psychiatric illness.
Correct.
That's harder to deal with if you have both of those things
That's correct.
than one. And is that a reason why people may actually be treating themselves with opioids, because they have these underlying problems?
Correct.
Now, if you have all three of them, which is represented in the red circle, what does that mean in terms of treating those individuals?
Well, it means that that by the time I'm able to get to them, or by the time they come in, they're really in a demoralized state. I mean, they've been doing this for decades or more. They've been having limited success or no success. Certainly by this point in time, families, done. They're tired. They've exhausted all the chances the individual is going to get. They're just sort of, they can't do it anymore. They're tired. They're exhausted. And of course, for the patient, they feel this sense of isolation and the lack of support, and they condemn themselves. They wonder, what could I have done? What should I have done? What role did I play in this?
And in your daily practice, when you're treating opioid addicted people, do you feel it's important to try to triage these patients and find out what they came to the table with?
Absolutely.
One or more of those circles.
One or more, and most importantly, to give them a sense of the hope that they're not bad. They're just sick. They're just unwell.
Well, is this the way that addiction should be treated?
That's what we're trying to do at
And-
Arcadia Trails. We're trying to create a model for really integrating treatment, bringing all the pieces to bear, giving the patient the best opportunity to live a life in recovery, but we have to do our part. And our part is to diagnose and appropriately treat these conditions and educate the family members that this is a more difficult road to travel.
So hypothetically, if you are trying to abate the nuisance of the opioid epidemic, there is a right way and a wrong way to do it, correct?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that term. And
Well, you want to do it the right way.
you certainly want to do it. If you're going to do it, you might as well do it the right way.
And Your Honor, at this time, all of these we have been showing you are contained in one exhibit. It's S4125, and I would move admission of that exhibit at this time.
Is this the diagram?
These are all the ones we just looked at. Yes, sir.
I thought you used these as demonstratives as opposed to, I don't have any objection if that's marked as an exhibit. Those should probably go in as court exhibits if you use them just as demonstratives.
They're exhibits to me, Your Honor, and I'd move admission of all these.
What's the defendant's objection?
I have no objection to the diagram marked as an exhibit. The others were used as just exemplars or demonstratives, and I don't have a problem with them. I just think they should be marked as a court exhibit.
He used them in his testimony, and they're a very important part of the record.
I'm going to admit S4125 as one exhibit. I think it consists of 5 different diagrams that were used, presented to Dr. Rojas.
May I approach and just leave this with the...
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Rojas, I think that I am done. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wick.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Rojas.
Good afternoon, sir.
Let me see if I understand a little bit about your history. You started with ExecuCare in 2005.
Correct.
When you started with ExecuCare, were you aware of the potential for opioid addiction?
At the time, I was not.
Okay. And when did you become aware of the potential for opioid addiction?
Well, in working with healthcare professionals and executives, very quickly we realized that that was part of how they'd gotten into trouble.
So right around 2005?
Yes, sir.
Now, you say you teach at the University of Oklahoma.
Yes, sir.
Are the people you teach at the University of Oklahoma, after you teach them, going to be aware of the potential for opioid addiction?
Health Sciences Center.
Health Sciences Center?
Yes, sir.
Okay. As a professor at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center, are you aware that that center currently offers substance abuse counseling to its students?
At the Health Sciences Center in the Student Counseling Center?
Yes.
Yes.
You teach psychiatry interns at OU?
Some medical students, psychology fellows.
And are you aware that all medical students trained at the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center are trained in addiction medicine, regardless of which specialty they choose to go into?
I believe they have some training.
Are you aware of similar training for medical residents who come through the OU School of Medicine?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Do you know if OU provides Data 2000 waiver training to medical students so that they will be able to use medicine to treat patients with opioid use disorder?
I'm not aware of that.
Are you aware of similar training for OU medical residents?
On?
The Data 2000 waiver?
I'm not aware of that. As a psychologist, some of that stuff I don't become involved with.
Okay. That's right. You're not a medical doctor, are you? You're a doctor
Correct.
of psychology.
I'm a psychologist.
Okay. Are you aware of continuing medical education for physicians provided by OU on the fundamentals of addiction medicine?
I'm aware of CME opportunities, yes.
Are you familiar with Project ECHO in place at Oklahoma State University?
I've heard of Project ECHO, yes.
Now, you've been treating people with both alcohol and opioid addiction now since 2005?
Approximately.
So that's 15 years roughly. In that time, had you ever treated someone who became addicted after being prescribed Duragesic?
No, I don't have any recollection of any of my patients ever being prescribed patches.
Are you familiar with Nucynta?
No, I am now.
Yeah. Had you ever treated a patient who became addicted using Nucynta?
No.
Give me an idea of some of the substances that caused the addiction that you treat.
Hydrocodone, oxycodone, and in some of my patients, they would take the patches from medical wastage boxes. So they weren't prescribed them, but they certainly sought them out and would obtain them where they could.
Have you ever treated someone who has been addicted as the result of treatment for chronic pain?
No.
The film you showed us, was that something produced by ExecuCare?
No, sir.
Not something you use in your practice?
It's something I do plan to use in future talks.
Not
and
something you've used in your practice?
not until I became aware of it, but I certainly plan to.
And you treat primarily people who have professional degrees or are executives?
Correct.
You don't treat anyone that's not addicted, do you?
I do have some patients who have psychiatric conditions but do not have
For
addiction.
purposes of your testimony here today, do you recognize a distinction, doctor, between dependence and addiction?
Yes,
Do you agree those are two different terms?
I do.
Does just having an opioid prescription sentence one to addiction?
No,
And that includes opioids used for long-term treatment?
I think the longer you're on them, time, dose, duration, I think those things do factor into risk going up.
But in all of that, you've never treated a patient who was treated with opioids for chronic pain?
No, sir.
Dr. Rojas, let me check with my brains over here. Give me
Yes, sir.
just a second.
Take your time.
I was reading all these questions, Doctor, and I had decided not to ask a single one of them. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, sir.
Just 2 follow-ups, Your Honor.
Yes, Mr. Whitten. I do, sir.
Dr. Rojas, he asked you about dependence versus addiction. I am a coffee drinker, and if I quit drinking coffee for any period of time, I get a little headache. Is that an example of dependence?
That is.
Am I addicted to coffee?
Well, if we begin to see aberrant behaviors, if you begin to, rob a Starbucks for that coffee, if you begin to not respond to, if a doctor tells you that you're being harmed by that coffee and you continue to do that, if your wife says she's done with your coffee drinking, she's not going to have it anymore, and you continue to do that despite those warnings for whatever reason, the aberrant decisions and the consequences and the things that you do that take from the quality of your life and the people around you, that's what begins to move you into addiction.
And coffee, caffeine is quite a different drug than opioids. Opioids are inherently addictive, are they not?
I think we've heard that here today many times.
And you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that.
It doesn't affect everybody equally, but it's inherently addictive. And, right?
Correct.
Doctor, one last question. Would it be a good idea to target someone who is at high risk for opioid addiction?
Excuse me, Your Honor, it's outside the scope of the direct and my cross.
I'm going to sustain the objection.
Thank you. That's all I have, Your Honor. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Dr. Rose, you may be excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You didn't, unless you had something else.
No, that's fine, Doctor. It's fine with me if he's excused.
Your Honor, do we have time to put a short witness on? Craig Box?
How do you define short?
Judge, it'd probably be better if we broke for the night, if that's okay with everybody.
We defer
It's
to you,
been a
Your Honor.
long day.
I'm going to go ahead and excuse everybody today. Again, I appreciate the preparation of the parties and hearing your arguments. I also thank those who've been with us in the court today for your respecting the decorum here. We will go ahead and adjourn today and begin again tomorrow at 9 a.m.
Thank you.